to global wastelands and periods of almost endless rain.
Alright, let's go back, way back, like billions of years back. Earth wasn't always the calm blue planet we know today. In the beginning it was anything but calm. There wasn't even an Earth yet, just a huge mess of space dust and gas floating around a young sun. It was chaos like a construction site, but without any workers or rules. Over time, gravity started doing its thing. It pulled bits and pieces of this space dust together. These chunks collided, sticking together to form larger and larger pieces. Imagine a giant game of cosmic bumper cars, but instead of cars, it's rocks smashing into each other at insane speeds. That's how our planet began to take shape, by getting smacked around. As more rocks piled on, all that smashing created a ton of heat. This heat turned Earth into a ball of liquid fire, with rivers of lava flowing everywhere. There were no trees, no oceans, no life, just molten rock and toxic gases swirling around. If you were somehow able to look at it, it would have been terrifying. Bright red, glowing and loud, with volcanoes exploding left and right. This stage is what scientists call the Hadean Eon, but honestly it was like Earth's nightmare phase. And then things got even crazier. About 4.5 billion years ago, another planet-sized object called Theia slammed into Earth. This wasn't just a little bump, it was a full-on collision. The impact was so intense that it knocked a huge chunk of Earth into space. Over time, that chunk came together to form something you see every night, the Moon. So yeah, the Moon is basically a giant souvenir from the time Earth got hit by a cosmic wrecking ball. But here's the wild part. All of this chaos, the heat, the collisions, the volcanoes, it was actually a good thing. It helped shape the Earth we know today. For example, all that heat melted the planet's metals, like iron and nickel, and pulled them toward the centre, creating Earth's core. That core gave us something super important, a magnetic field. Without it, we wouldn't have any protection from the sun's deadly radiation. And without that protection, life wouldn't stand a chance. Eventually, Earth started to cool down. Slowly but surely, the surface began to harden. Steam from all those volcanoes filled the air, and when the planet cooled enough, that steam condensed into water. This is when the first oceans began to form. But at this point, Earth still wasn't a nice place to live. The air was full of poisonous gases, and the surface was constantly getting smacked by asteroids. It was like Earth was a punching bag for space. Still, the pieces were falling into place. The ground was solidifying, the water was gathering, and the stage was being set for something incredible, the start of life. But that part of the story didn't come easy, and it definitely didn't happen quickly. When Earth finally started to cool, something incredible happened. All that steam in the atmosphere began to condense and fall back to the surface as rain. This wasn't just a light drizzle, it poured for millions of years. Slowly the water collected in low-lying areas, forming Earth's first oceans. These early oceans didn't look like anything you'd recognise today. They were hot, murky, and filled with chemicals from volcanic eruptions. The skies above were thick with toxic gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and ammonia. It wasn't a pretty scene, but it was the perfect setup for something amazing. These oceans were where life began. Scientists don't know exactly how it happened, but there are some strong ideas. One of the most popular is the primordial soup theory. Imagine those oceans as a giant chemical broth filled with the raw ingredients for life. Things like carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen were floating around, interacting with each other. Then something gave them a spark. Maybe it was lightning striking the water, or heat from underwater volcanic vents, or even radiation from the sun. Whatever it was, it triggered a reaction, causing simple molecules to join together and form the building blocks of life. From those building blocks came the first living things, tiny single-celled organisms. These were microscopic and extremely simple. If you saw them under a microscope today, they'd look like little blobs. But those blobs were the start of something much bigger, At first, they lived off the chemicals in the water around them, absorbing nutrients to survive. Then over time, some of them developed a new trick: photosynthesis. Photosynthesis allowed these tiny organisms to use sunlight as a source of energy. It was a revolutionary process because it produced oxygen as a byproduct. At first, this oxygen didn't make much of a difference. It dissolved into the oceans or reacted with rocks on the ocean floor. But over millions of years, the amount of oxygen started to build up. This gradual rise in oxygen led to one of the most important changes in Earth's history. It's called the Great Oxidation Event, and it transformed the planet forever. Before this, the atmosphere was mostly made of gases like carbon dioxide and methane. But as oxygen levels increased, the atmosphere began to shift. The air became less toxic, creating conditions that would one day support complex life. This wasn't an easy transition. Many of the organisms living at the time couldn't handle the oxygen. To them, it was deadly. As oxygen spread through the oceans and atmosphere, it wiped out a huge number of these early life forms. It was one of Earth's first mass extinction events. But at the same time, it opened the door for new types of organisms that could thrive in this changing environment. So these tiny microbes didn't just survive, they shaped the world around them. They laid the groundwork for everything that came next, from the first complex organisms to the rise of plants, animals, and eventually humans. But at this stage, Earth was still a quiet, watery world. There were no plants on land, no fish in the seas, just simple life floating in the oceans, slowly changing the planet in ways no one could have imagined. As those tiny organisms kept pumping out oxygen through photosynthesis, something incredible was happening, even if it took millions of years to notice. Slowly, oxygen started to escape into the atmosphere. This change wasn't just a small tweak, it was massive. Before this, Earth's atmosphere was filled with gases like methane, carbon dioxide, and ammonia. To put it simply, it was not a place anything like us could survive. But as oxygen levels increased, the planet was on its way to becoming a home for more complex life. This period is known as the Great Oxidation Event. Think of it like Earth's first big makeover. The air became less toxic, and the oceans started to change too. At first, the oxygen reacted with iron in the water, creating rust. That rust sank to the ocean floor, forming huge deposits that are still mined today. But eventually there was too much oxygen for the iron to handle. It began building up in the atmosphere instead. For some organisms, this was the start of something new and exciting. Oxygen was a game changer. It allowed life to grow bigger and more complex. For others, though, it was a disaster. Many early microbes couldn't survive in the presence of oxygen. To them, it was like poison. This led to one of the first major extinction events in Earth's history. But extinction on one side meant opportunity on the other. The life forms that could adapt to oxygen had a massive advantage, and they started to thrive. But oxygen didn't just change life, it changed the planet itself. The atmosphere became more stable, and the skies turned blue for the first time. The ozone layer, which protects Earth from harmful ultraviolet radiation, began to form. This was huge because it made the surface of the planet safer for life. Before the ozone layer, the sun's radiation would have fried anything that tried to survive on land. With oxygen in the air and protection from the sun, the stage was set for some big changes. Life was no longer limited to simple, single-celled organisms. Over time, these tiny microbes started to evolve into something more complex. They began forming colonies and working together, creating the first multicellular life. This was a huge leap forward. Instead of just floating around as individual cells, these new organisms could grow, specialize, and interact in ways that were completely new. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Earth was still a tough place to live. The planet went through a series of ice ages during this time, with glaciers covering much of the surface. These frozen periods, known as snowball Earth events, were incredibly harsh. The oceans froze over, and life was pushed to its limits. But somehow those early organisms found ways to survive. They clung to life in small pockets of liquid water, waiting for the ice to melt. When the planet finally warmed up again, life came back stronger than ever. Oxygen levels continued to rise, and the oceans became rich with nutrients. This combination of factors set the stage for what came next, a period of explosive growth. and innovation that would change the planet forever. After billions of years of simple life quietly doing its thing, something extraordinary happened. About 540 million years ago, life went from barely noticeable to full-on spectacular. Scientists call this the Cambrian explosion, and it was exactly what it sounds like, a sudden burst of new life forms appearing in the oceans. It's like nature hit the fast-forward button on evolution, and the results were wild. Before this, life on Earth was pretty boring. Most organisms were tiny, single-celled, or looked like blobs. But during the Cambrian period, all kinds of strange and fascinating creatures showed up. It wasn't just a handful of new species. Entire groups of animals emerged that had never been seen before. This was the moment when most of the basic body plans we see in animals today were established. Think of it as the original blueprint for life. One of the most famous creatures from this time is the trilobite. Imagine a creepy little bug with a hard shell scuttling around the ocean floor. Trilobites were incredibly successful and stuck around for hundreds of millions of years, but they were just the tip of the iceberg. The oceans were suddenly filled with bizarre, alien-looking animals. Take the Opabinia, for example. This little guy had 5 eyes and a long tube-like appendage sticking out of its head, ending in a claw. It used this claw to grab food and shove it into its mouth. Then there was Anomalocaris, a predator about the size of a loaf of bread, which was massive for the time. With its sharp, spiky mouthparts, it was the ocean's top predator, a true nightmare for anything smaller. But it wasn't just about weird shapes and sharp teeth. The Cambrian explosion also introduced new adaptations that were revolutionary. Eyes started to evolve, giving animals the ability to see their surroundings for the first time. Hard shells and exoskeletons appeared, offering protection against predators. Even simple brains and nervous systems began to develop, allowing animals to react to their environment in new ways. So what caused this explosion of life? That's a question scientists are still trying to answer. One idea is that oxygen levels had finally reached a point where more complex life could thrive. Another theory is that genetic changes, like the evolution of the first Hox genes, which helped determine body structure, allowed for greater diversity. It could also be that predator-prey relationships drove animals to evolve quickly to survive. Whatever the reason, it was a turning point in Earth's history. The Cambrian explosion wasn't just about creating new species, it was about creating diversity. Animals started to specialise. Some became predators, hunting and eating other creatures. Others adapted to avoid being eaten, like the soft-bodied animals that burrowed into the seafloor for safety. This back-and-forth struggle between hunters and prey drove innovation, making life more dynamic than ever before. By the end of the Cambrian period, the oceans were bustling with activity. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about competition, adaptation, and evolution. The groundwork was laid for everything that came after, from fish to reptiles to dinosaurs, and eventually us. But life still had a long way to go. This explosion of diversity was just the beginning. The next chapters in Earth's story would see animals venture beyond the oceans, new forms of life rise to dominance, and the planet itself undergo transformations that would shape its future. After the Cambrian explosion, life didn't slow down. It kept evolving, adapting, and spreading. By the time the Ordovician period rolled around, about 485 million years ago, the oceans were teeming with life. This was a time of major growth and change, but it wasn't just about weird-looking sea creatures anymore. Something new and exciting was starting to emerge. Vertebrates. Vertebrates are animals with backbones, and they were a big deal. Before this, most creatures in the oceans had soft bodies or simple exoskeletons. But now animals were developing internal skeletons made of cartilage, and later bone. This gave them more structure and strength, allowing them to grow larger and move in ways that weren't possible before. The first vertebrates were fish, but not the kind you'd recognise today. These early fish didn't have jaws, they were more like slimy, eel-like creatures with sucker-like mouths. One of the most well-known examples is Haikuichthys, a tiny fish-like creature that's often called the ancestor of all vertebrates. It didn't look like much, but it was a huge step forward in evolution. As time went on, these fish started to get fancier. By the Devonian period, about 419 million years ago, fish had evolved jaws, which was a total game changer. Jaws allowed them to bite, chew, and hunt in ways they never could before. Some fish, like the Dunkleosteus, even became apex predators. Dunkleosteus was a massive armoured fish with a terrifyingly strong bite. It could easily crush through the shells of other animals, making it the king of the seas. But it wasn't just about fish. The Ordovician and Devonian periods were also when life began its first experiments with land. Plants started spreading out of the water and onto the shore, forming the earliest mosses and small vascular plants. These plants weren't much to look at. No flowers, no trees, but they were a crucial step in turning Earth's barren land into a place where animals could live. While plants were taking their first steps onto land, some animals were eyeing the possibility too. The first to make the leap were arthropods, creatures like millipedes and scorpions. These early land dwellers probably didn't venture far from water at first. They still needed moisture to survive, but they were paving the way for something even bigger. Back in the oceans, fish were getting more and more adventurous. Some species started spending time in shallow waters, where they could find more food and avoid predators. Over time, their fins began to evolve into something resembling limbs. This was the beginning of a major transition, the move from water to land. One of the most famous creatures from this time is Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik was a fish, but it had features that made it look more like a land animal. It had sturdy, fin-like limbs that could support its weight in shallow water, or even on land for short periods. It also had a neck, which allowed it to move its head independently of its body, something most fish can't do. Tiktaalik wasn't alone. Other creatures like Ichthyostega and Acanthostega were also experimenting with life on land. These early tetrapods, four-limbed animals, still spent most of their time in the water, but they were the first vertebrates to venture onto dry land. By the end of the Devonian period, the stage was set for a whole new chapter in life's story. Plants were spreading, fish were thriving, and the first vertebrates were crawling onto land. But life wasn't done evolving. The next big leap was just around the corner, and it would change the world forever. Around 359 million years ago, Earth entered a new chapter in its story, the Carboniferous period. If you could step back in time and visit this era, you'd find a planet that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. Towering plants covered vast swamps, the air was thick with humidity, and the oxygen levels were higher than they have ever been in Earth's history. This wasn't just any period, it was the age of giants. Let's start with the plants. During this time, Earth's land was dominated by massive forests of ferns, club mosses and horsetails. These weren't your average houseplants. Some of these trees grew over 100 feet tall, with trunks as thick as a small car. These plants didn't have flowers or seeds like modern trees. Instead, they reproduced using spores, which they scattered in huge quantities. These swamps and forests stretched across the planet, creating a green, jungle-like world. Now here's where things get interesting. All those plants were pumping out oxygen through photosynthesis. And because there was so much vegetation, oxygen levels in the atmosphere skyrocketed. Scientists estimate that oxygen made up about 30 to 35% of the air during this time, compared to just 21% today. This had some wild effects on the animals living in this oxygen-rich world. Arthropods, like insects and spiders, don't have lungs like we do. They breathe through small openings in their bodies, which means the more oxygen in the air, the bigger they can grow. And grow they did. During the Carboniferous period, some arthropods reached terrifying sizes. Take the Arthropleura, for example. This millipede-like creature could grow up to 8 feet long. Imagine a centipede the size of a small car crawling through the forests. Thankfully, it was a vegetarian, but that doesn't make it any less creepy. Flying insects also took advantage of the high oxygen levels. Meganeura, a type of dragonfly, had a wingspan of over 2 feet, about the size of a modern crow. These giant insects ruled the skies, hunting smaller arthropods and showing off what nature could do when oxygen was in abundance. While the land was a jungle of towering plants and oversized bugs, the water was still home to some impressive creatures. Sharks and other fish were thriving in the oceans, and amphibians were becoming more dominant in the swamps. These amphibians were the ancestors of modern frogs and salamanders, but they were much larger and more diverse. Some grew as long as 13 feet, prowling through the water and occasionally venturing onto land. But amphibians weren't the only ones making moves on land. Something revolutionary was happening: the evolution of amniotic eggs. These eggs had hard shells that protected the developing embryo inside, allowing animals to lay their eggs on land instead of in water. This was a game changer because it freed these animals from being tied to aquatic environments for reproduction. These early egg-laying creatures were the ancestors of reptiles, and they were setting the stage for a major shift in Earth's ecosystems. Back in the forests, those towering plants were quietly building something we still rely on today: coal. When these plants died, they fell into the swampy waters and didn't fully decay because of the low oxygen levels in the mud. Over millions of years, the pressure from layers of sediment turned this plant material into coal. The vast coal deposits we mine today were formed during the Carboniferous period. But as with all good things, the Carboniferous period eventually came to an end. The planet's climate started to shift, becoming cooler and drier. The lush forests began to shrink, and the giant insects that relied on high oxygen levels started to disappear. The Earth was changing, and these changes would pave the way for new types of life to take over. By the time the Carboniferous period transitioned into its later stages, life on land was evolving rapidly. Amphibians were still a dominant force, but they were facing new challenges. The climate was becoming drier, and their dependence on water for reproduction and survival was starting to limit their ability to thrive in these changing conditions. This is where a new group of animals began to rise to the occasion: reptiles. Reptiles were different from amphibians in one crucial way: they were no longer tied to water. How? They had developed something that completely changed the game: amniotic eggs. These eggs had hard or leathery shells that kept the embryo inside safe and moist. This allowed reptiles to lay their eggs on dry land, far away from predators lurking in the water. Imagine being able to move away from crowded, dangerous swamps to explore vast, open landscapes. That's exactly what reptiles did, and it gave them a huge evolutionary advantage. But it wasn't just the eggs. Reptiles also had tough, scaly skin that helped them retain water in dry environments. This meant they could survive in areas where amphibians would dry out and die. These adaptations allowed reptiles to spread out and take over parts of the land that had previously been uninhabitable. One of the early reptiles that left its mark on this period was Hylonomus. This small lizard-like creature is one of the first true reptiles we know of. It scurried around the forests, eating insects and other small creatures. While it wasn't very big, probably about the size of a modern gecko, it represented the future of life on land. As reptiles continued to evolve, they began to diversify. Some stayed small and agile, hunting insects and other tiny prey. Others grew larger, developing stronger jaws and teeth to take on bigger meals. These early reptiles were still relatively simple compared to what came later, but they were already showing signs of the adaptability that would make them so successful. At the same time, amphibians weren't completely out of the picture. They still thrived in wetter environments, growing to massive sizes in some cases. One example is the Diplocaulus, a strange-looking amphibian with a boomerang-shaped head. Scientists think this unusual head shape might have helped it glide through the water or even deter predators. But as the climate continued to change, amphibians struggled to keep up. The land was becoming drier, and large swampy forests were disappearing. Reptiles, with their ability to survive in harsher conditions, began to dominate more and more. This wasn't just a slow shift, It was a major turning point in Earth's history. The evolution of reptiles also set the stage for something even bigger. Over time, these early reptiles would split into two main groups, the synapsids and the sauropsids. Synapsids are the ancestors of modern mammals, while sauropsids are the ancestors of reptiles and birds. This division marked the beginning of a long evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to the age of dinosaurs and, much later, the rise of mammals. But before we get there, life on Earth would face one of its biggest challenges yet. The Carboniferous period was drawing to a close, and the world was about to enter a new era, the Permian. This would be a time of incredible change and evolution, but also one of the most devastating extinction events in Earth's history. Life on Earth has always been a story of survival, adaptation, and at times devastating loss. As the Permian period began about 299 million years ago, life was thriving in ways that had never been seen before. Reptiles were diversifying, amphibians still held their ground in wetter regions, and lush forests dominated the land. But this era wasn't destined to last. The Earth was about to face its most catastrophic challenge yet, the Great Dying. The Permian period started off strong. The climate was warm and life had spread to almost every corner of the planet. Reptiles were evolving rapidly, with some growing larger and more specialised. Synapsids, a group of reptiles that would eventually lead to mammals, became dominant land predators. Creatures like Dimetrodon, with its sail-like back, ruled the food chain. At the same time, Earth's continents were coming together to form a supercontinent called Pangaea. This massive landmass wasn't just a geographical shift, it had a profound impact on the planet's climate. With so much land clumped together, weather patterns became extreme. The interior of Pangaea turned into a harsh desert, while the coastlines experienced seasonal monsoons. These changes started to put pressure on many species, but the real disaster was still to come. Around 252 million years ago, a series of volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia unleashed a catastrophic chain of events. These eruptions weren't just your average lava flows, they were on a scale we can barely comprehend. For hundreds of thousands of years, massive amounts of lava and gases spewed into the atmosphere, releasing staggering levels of carbon dioxide. This sudden spike in greenhouse gases caused global temperatures to soar. Oceans warmed, ice caps melted, and the planet's ecosystems began to collapse. To make matters worse, the oceans started to lose oxygen, turning vast stretches of water into dead zones where nothing could survive. Marine life, which had flourished for millions of years, was hit especially hard. Coral reefs disappeared, fish populations plummeted, and entire ecosystems were wiped out. On land, things weren't much better. The rising temperatures and changing climate made it difficult for plants and animals to adapt. Forests dried up, and with less vegetation to absorb carbon dioxide, the greenhouse effect intensified. Wildfires raged across the supercontinent, destroying what little plant life remained. The results were catastrophic. An estimated 90% of marine species and 70% of land species went extinct during this period. This wasn't just the end of an era, it was the closest life on Earth has ever come to being completely wiped out. The event is now known as the Permian Triassic extinction, or simply the Great Dying. But here's the remarkable thing about life. It's resilient. Even in the face of near-total extinction, some species managed to survive. A few hardy plants, insects, and reptiles clung to life in isolated pockets, adapting to the harsh conditions. These survivors became the foundation for the next chapter in Earth's story. The Great Dying was a reset button for life on Earth. It cleared the way for new species to rise and thrive in the aftermath. As the planet slowly recovered, the first dinosaurs began to emerge, along with the ancestors of mammals and birds. This was the start of the Mesozoic era, also known as the Age of Reptiles. After the devastation of the Great Dying, Earth was a shadow of its former self. The Permian Triassic extinction had left the planet nearly lifeless, with barren landscapes, acidic oceans, and skies thick with greenhouse gases. But life, as it always does, found a way. Slowly, over millions of years, Earth began to recover. This was the start of the Triassic period, a time of rebuilding, adaptation, and the birth of new creatures that would shape the future. The early Triassic was tough. Most of the dominant species from the Permian had been wiped out, leaving behind only a few survivors. These animals and plants had to adapt to an environment that was still harsh and unstable. The land was dry and arid, with deserts stretching across the supercontinent of Pangaea. Rain was scarce in the interior regions, and the oceans, still recovering from oxygen loss, supported only limited marine life. Despite these challenges, life began to bounce back. Plants were among the first to recover. Hardy ferns and conifers spread across the land, stabilising the soil and providing food for herbivores. These plants were well suited to the dry conditions and became the foundation of the new ecosystems. On land, reptiles started to take centre stage. Some of these were descendants of the synapsids that had ruled the Permian, but they were smaller and less dominant than before. Instead, a new group of reptiles called archosaurs began to rise. Archosaurs were incredibly adaptable, with features that helped them thrive in the tough conditions of the Triassic. They had strong lungs and upright limbs, which allowed them to move efficiently and survive in low oxygen environments. One of the most fearsome archosaurs of this time was Postosuchus. This predator was about 15 feet long, with sharp teeth and powerful legs. It hunted other reptiles and smaller animals, ruling the land as one of the top predators of the Triassic. But not all archosaurs were predators. Some, like early ancestors of crocodiles, began to evolve into creatures better suited for life in the water. In the oceans, life was also making a comeback. The first marine reptiles appeared, like the sleek, fish-like ichthyosaurs. These creatures were built for speed, with streamlined bodies and large eyes for hunting in the depths. Another group, the plesiosaurs, had long necks and paddle-like limbs, making them excellent swimmers. Together, these marine reptiles began to reclaim the seas that had been devastated by the Great Dying. But the most significant development of the Triassic was the appearance of something new and unexpected: the first dinosaurs. At first, these early dinosaurs weren't the massive, awe-inspiring creatures we think of today. They were small, bipedal reptiles that ran on two legs, using their agility to hunt or escape predators. Some of the earliest known dinosaurs, like Eoraptor, were no bigger than a dog. These early dinosaurs had some key advantages. Their lightweight, hollow bones made them fast and efficient movers. They also had a high rate of reproduction, which allowed their populations to grow quickly. Over time, these traits would help them rise to dominance, but for now, they were just one part of a rapidly evolving ecosystem. The end of the Triassic period, around 201 million years ago, was marked by yet another extinction event. Though not as catastrophic as the Great Dying, this time massive volcanic eruptions released huge amounts of carbon dioxide, causing global warming and ocean acidification. Many species that had flourished during the Triassic were wiped out, but the dinosaurs survived. In the aftermath, they began to spread and diversify, setting the stage for the Jurassic period and their reign as the dominant animals on Earth. The Triassic was a period of recovery and transformation. It took millions of years for life to rebuild after the Great Dying, but by the end of the period, the seeds of the future had been planted. Dinosaurs were ready to take over, and the world was about to enter one of its most iconic eras. By the end of the Triassic period, Earth was ready for a major transformation. The devastating events of the Great Dying had reshaped the planet, clearing the way for new species to emerge and thrive. Over millions of years, life had rebounded in extraordinary ways. Plants, marine reptiles, and land-dwelling archosaurs had all adapted to the challenges of a changing world. But one group of animals was about to take centre stage and dominate the planet like no others before them: the dinosaurs. So what set the stage for their rise? A combination of environmental shifts, evolutionary advantages, and sheer survival. Let's break it down. First, there was the layout of the land. During the Triassic, Earth's continents were still joined together in the massive supercontinent Pangaea. This meant that land animals had the freedom to move and spread across vast areas. There were no barriers like oceans or mountain ranges to isolate populations, which allowed species to migrate, compete, and evolve on a global scale. The extensive deserts and dry conditions of Pangaea also favoured reptiles like archosaurs and early dinosaurs, who were better equipped to handle the heat and scarcity of water. Next, there was the evolutionary edge of the dinosaurs themselves. Early dinosaurs were small and agile, which gave them an advantage over other land animals. They could run faster, hunt more efficiently, and escape predators with ease. Their upright posture, standing on two legs instead of sprawling out like lizards, allowed them to conserve energy while moving. It also freed up their forelimbs for other purposes, like grasping prey or defending themselves. But it wasn't just about speed and agility. Dinosaurs also had efficient respiratory systems that allowed them to survive in the relatively low oxygen environment of the Triassic. These adaptations, combined with their ability to reproduce quickly, made them incredibly resilient. Meanwhile, their competitors were struggling. Many of the dominant land animals from the Permian, like synapsids, had been wiped out during the Great Dying. The few that survived were no match for the rapidly evolving archosaurs and dinosaurs. By the end of the Triassic, dinosaurs had begun to outcompete other reptiles for resources and territory. In the oceans, marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs were flourishing. These predators dominated the seas, hunting fish and smaller marine creatures with precision. While they weren't dinosaurs, they shared some of the same evolutionary advantages, like streamlined bodies and powerful adaptations for survival in harsh environments. Their success in the oceans mirrored the dinosaurs' rise on land, but perhaps the most critical moment came at the very end of the Triassic. Around 201 million years ago, another mass extinction event struck. This time it was triggered by massive volcanic eruptions in the Central Atlantic magmatic province. These eruptions released huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, causing rapid global warming and ocean acidification. Many species couldn't adapt to the sudden changes and were wiped out. This extinction event, while devastating, left a void that dinosaurs were perfectly positioned to fill. Their adaptability, resilience, and evolutionary advantages allowed them to survive when so many others didn't. As the Jurassic period began, dinosaurs spread across the planet, growing larger, more diverse, and more dominant. The Triassic period was a time of recovery and experimentation, setting the stage for the most famous chapter in Earth's history. Without the challenges and changes of the Triassic, the age of dinosaurs might never have happened, and it raises an interesting question. What if the Great Dying hadn't cleared the way? What if another group of animals had risen to dominance instead? The story of Earth before the dinosaurs is a story of survival, transformation, and resilience. It's a reminder that life on this planet has faced incredible challenges and always found a way forward. The age of the dinosaurs was just beginning, but the foundation for their reign had been laid millions of years before. And there you have it, the story of Earth before the dinosaurs. From fiery beginnings to the rise of early life, and from mass extinctions to the incredible recovery that set the stage for the dinosaurs, it's clear that our planet has been through more twists and turns than we can imagine. It's mind-blowing to think about how everything we see today, the landscapes, the animals, and even ourselves, can be traced back to these ancient events. Earth wasn't always the blue and green paradise we know now. It was harsh, violent, and unpredictable. Yet life adapted, evolved, and thrived, shaping the planet into what it is today. But here's the thing, Earth's story doesn't stop here. The dinosaurs were just one chapter in a much bigger book. What came before them, and what came after, are all pieces of a puzzle that's still being pieced together. So what do you think? Do you ever wonder how different things could have been if events had unfolded just a little differently? Maybe another species would have dominated the planet instead of the dinosaurs, or maybe Earth would have remained a barren rock in space. If you enjoyed this dive into our planet's past, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And if you're curious about what came next, when the dinosaurs ruled the Earth, let me know in the comments. Who knows, that might be the story we explore next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.